Hi, this is Danny Doyle. I just wanted to throw something out real quick to celebrate 10,000 subscribers. I didn't really have a sub-special planned on like 5K where I did the Smash or Pass Demons video. I didn't really ever expect to hit 10,000 subscribers. It's actually kind of an intimidating number. So I instead am throwing together a Q&A. I made a forum in my Discord server as well as a community post on my YouTube channel and asked people if they had any questions for me, saying that I would answer all of the ones that I could. Okay, so the first question we have is from fellow YouTuber Blue Luna, and they asked, does Pent have Nosferatu or Vantage? Pent does not actually have access to Nosferatu, as he can only use Anima and Stabs, and Nosferatu is a dark tome in Fire Emblem 7, and most other Fire Emblems, although it's a light tome in a few of them. Pent also does not have access to Vantage, because Vantage is not in Fire Emblem 7. In fact, most skills are not in Fire Emblem 7. In fact, I'm fairly certain the only skills in FE7 are Canto and Lethality. I understand that you're not super familiar with games that aren't Fire Emblem Fates, but this feels like a really basic thing to get wrong, so I'm kind of disappointed in you. The next question is from Maddie, and he asks, will these questions be anonymous? And yeah, I should probably make them anonymous, so from now on, the questions will be anonymous. And with that in mind, I'm gonna group them into categories. So the first category I'll address is questions about YouTube. The first question was why I picked my profile picture as lesbian flag Lena, and it actually got asked by quite a few people. Unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer for this. I like Fire Emblem 1, so I wanted to pick one of the FE1 portraits, and I'm a lesbian, so I wanted to make the portrait have the recolor. I thought that would be kind of a cute little gimmick. I'm pretty sure my mind just gravitated towards Lena because Fire Emblem 1 Warp Staff good, because it's an Arcanea game. But honestly, I don't even really like Lena in Fire Emblem 1, like I much prefer Maria as my go-to warper. I guess Lena kind of fits the color scheme since she has orange robes and red hair, and also Lesbian and Lena both start with L, and I take a bunch of L's on YouTube, so yeah, I guess that's the explanation. The next question was what got you started making content on YouTube, and there's actually kind of two answers to this. The first one is I started doing Let's Plays of 0% growths of various games in the series. I started with FE9 and then I did FE4 and Awakening. Those Let's Plays are pretty bad quality-wise in terms of like, my commentary isn't great, the audio balancing is fucking awful, and the video resolution is not great either, and the thumbnails are of course pretty trash. But I kind of just wanted to document doing every single game in a zero growth setting, and that is still kind of a long-term goal of mine. It's something I've moved away from as the channel has grown, but it is still probably my favorite challenge run, and I apply it more to ROM hacks now than the main series games, just because I find them more enjoyable. But the thing that got me making more long-form content was when Engage released, and Rosado was one of the more prominently talked about characters because of all the gender stuff he's got going on. I felt like there was some weirdness in the way people talked about him, and I wanted to make a video addressing that, talking about why I didn't really like it, and putting my own thoughts out there. And that video did pretty well for me, all things considered, as the first, like, non-Let's Play video. And by pure coincidence, I had also been working on a for fun video, sort of hypotheticalizing personal skills that could be given to the FE4 cast in the event of a remake. So I released that about a week later, just because that was when I finished it, and that video also did pretty well by my standards back then. And in that video, I offhandedly mentioned that I thought the FE4 remake was guaranteed to come out soon. Someone responded in the comment section saying that they didn't think that was the case and asking me to go over all of the evidence for it. So I decided to do a video diving into whether or not there would be an FE4 remake. And recorded the process of me looking at all of the quote-unquote evidence around it and coming to the conclusion that actually I was wrong. There isn't any solid evidence of an FE4 remake incoming. So then I released that video, and it also did fairly well. So now I had 3 videos 3 weeks in a row that didn't fit in my usual style of Let's Plays, and all of them did better than the average Let's Play episode. So I decided that it would be kind of cool to just sort of pivot into this style of video, making it more regularly. I made a couple of non-Let's Play videos before this time, just sort of scattered on my channel. There was a video about triangle strategy, and a couple of videos about Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and Fire Emblem Engage when they came out, but this was the first time that I had 3 videos close to each other, and all of them doing relatively well. Like, by my channel's current standards, I would consider them failures, but back then, the numbers were something that I found impressive. So that sort of convinced me that I was not only capable of making these sorts of videos, but also that there was at least a small audience out there who found my videos interesting enough to justify the effort I put into them. And when I moved across the country, I had to leave my job, so as a result of that, I had a lot more free time to sink into YouTube. And the more time and effort I put in, the more success I got, which was pretty nice, although I definitely think some amount of it does come down to luck. Like, I don't want to say that this success is completely unearned, because I want to acknowledge the hard work that I put in, and I do like a lot of the content that I make. But it's also pretty impossible to deny that a large part of YouTube's success or failure simply comes down to how lucky you get with the algorithm. There are a lot of YouTube channels that I would consider to be much better put together than my own that are significantly less successful, and I'm not even especially big. And on the other hand of things, there's some absolute trash slop channels that have millions of subscribers. I believe to an extent that YouTube does reward the effort you put into it, but it's not always going to be even amongst who it's distributed with. The next YouTube related questions are: what is your favorite video or least favorite video or most underrated video? A lot of questions of that variety. I'll answer my least favorite videos first because it's an easy answer even if it's a little bit unsatisfying. I think a lot of my older videos, especially my older Let's Plays, have aged very badly. Although this makes sense, this was when I was first starting out. I feel like my skill in both editing and structuring things has gotten a lot better. And this applies not only to more objective stuff like bad audio mixing, but also subjective things. Like, I think the way that my videos flow are a lot more enjoyable now than they were even a year ago. But also because a lot of my opinions have changed over the course of the past couple of years. The more you engage with something, the more you think about it, the more you're going to change your mind about some aspects. And as I started engaging with Fire Emblem full-time as basically a job, I started having different takes than I used to. Some of them are just more informed. There's definitely some misinformation in the commentary of early Let's Plays, but there's also a lot of opinions that have changed. Like, I used to like Path of Radiance a lot more than I do now. I used to like Fates a lot less than I do now, especially the Revelation route. In fact, even when I made my Rev Defense video, I liked Rev less than I do now. And I feel like if I remade that video today, I would be a lot kinder to Rev than I was. I was sort of half-hearted in my defense of Revelation before, whereas now I'm much more full hog in my adoration of that game. But if I had to pick an absolute least favorite video, it's going to be my worst units of all time tier list. Funny enough, that's actually my most viewed video, and I kind of hate it. Its thumbnail is awful, and the audio mixing, while not terrible, is definitely a below the standard that I hold myself to today. It's also divided into 2 separate videos, kind of needlessly. I was afraid of releasing long videos back then, but I feel like it would flow a lot better if it was just a single 3-hour video instead of 2-hour-and-a-half ones. But I think the worst thing about that video is it's just full of bad takes. Like, I even made a follow-up about 6 months later because so many of the opinions I no longer held after just looking at the games that the units were from. Things like Wyvern Virion being good, or like Flora is outclassed by generics, or a just like complete misrepresentation of Vika's combat in hard mode. I don't know if it's my worst video, there's probably worse ones out there, but it's the one I dislike the most. As for my favorites, well, they're usually the most successful videos I make, and I can often predict their success beforehand. The Worst Lords video is one that I was very happy with, and I was happy to see that it did as well as I expected. And based on its current trajectory, it looks like a similar thing is going to happen with the Worst Dancers video, albeit to a slightly lesser extent than Worst Lords. And these are both videos that I spent a lot of time working on, so I'm happy that that work has paid off in dividends. I'm also really happy with my Oify and Est videos. The Oify one is probably always going to have a bit of a special place in my heart, just because that was my first really successful video. It hit 10k pretty absurdly quickly, at least by my channel standards. And at the time of recording, it's still my 4th best performing video, so that's pretty awesome. So I would say my favorite videos on their own merits are probably the Lords one and the Oify one. But I do also want to shout out my Mercedes video. Not the one about her as a unit, although that I also think is quite good, but the character video, which performed pretty poorly, and is still only sitting at about 4,000 views, but I genuinely think is one of my better character analysis videos. I know a lot of people are more interested in gameplay stuff than story stuff, and honestly that's fine, we all come to the series for different reasons. But if you're one of the people who cares about the stories in Fire Emblem and you haven't seen it already, I would recommend checking it out. Okay, next we have what would you say is your greatest struggle as a YouTuber? And I would say that my biggest difficulty is depersonalizing from negativity. Even though I'm a very small YouTuber, I do have an internet presence, and anytime you have an internet presence, you're going to attract some number of haters. And this is even more true for marginalized people, and hey, disabled queer woman here, so triple trouble. It's often easy enough to shrug off and ignore the obvious bad faith haters, but I never want to get to the point where I just assume that any and all criticism is bad faith. And as a result of that, I sometimes find myself humoring bad faith comments for far longer than they deserve. And at least for me, the more you engage with that sort of stuff, the more it infects your brain with negativity. So it can end up as a kind of difficult balancing act, trying to find the space to not just dismiss any disagreement or criticism offhand, while at the same time not humoring people who are not approaching conversations in good faith. That, and I really don't like being misunderstood, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And so when people seem to misrepresent my videos, or in some cases just straight up lie about things that I said, it bothers me. I wish it didn't, but it does. And like, to an extent, I know that that's just giving the trolls what they want, but sometimes it's hard to tell trolls from genuine criticism or people who misunderstand things. And I try to err on the side of caution, not wanting to just immediately assume the worst about people. That's a bit of a downer, so let's move on to the next YouTube question, which is actually a bunch of questions. I got several people asking about upcoming projects that I had mentioned and whether they were still happening or what had happened to them. I'll start by talking about a more general answer as to why there are so many things that got announced a while ago and just haven't come to fruition. My ADHD has me constantly thinking of new, ooh, that would be cool ideas, and sometimes even starting on them, before I inevitably abandon them to go work on something else. I have a graveyard of dozens of 20% finished projects that will just never see the light of day. And even a few Let's Plays that are like 2/3 of the way finished and probably won't be completed. But even discarding those, there are many videos that I do plan on putting out someday, TM, but work just stalled on them or I moved on to the next project. And this is especially true for videos I was working on in December, because I kinda got burned out and decided to go on a break, and technically I still am on the break, maybe, question mark? I mean, I'm pumping out a lot of videos now, so maybe not, but I haven't gone back to those yet, although many of them do have specific reasons for it. And since there were a few comments asking after specific videos, I figured I would address each of them. The Fire Emblem Engage tier list is one that a couple of people have been very enthusiastically asking about on, well, just about every community post or video that I put up. And the truth is, I just don't have much to say about the Community Engage tier list. it was pretty standard. So while Fire Emblem 9's tier list had some absurdities that I could talk about, Fire Emblem Engage's is more like, yeah, this person was ranked as C, and maybe I'd have them as B, but I can see C as reasonable, and I think an entire video of that would be kind of boring. However, I do have a couple of discussion ideas I think I can use the Engage list as a jumping off point for addressing. So I am going to be making a video that is tangentially related to the Engage tier list. It's just not going to be in the exact same style as the FE9 one. As it turns out, most of your opinions on Engage are just pretty standard. And most of my opinions on Engage are also pretty standard. I had someone ask about the video I mentioned about my first Conquest Lunatic playthrough, and this video's probably scrapped. I feel like it's been too long since the stream series. I did definitely have some thoughts I wanted to put out there, because I feel like a lot of the discourse around Lunatic Conquest is just sort of stuck into a very singular way of playing the game. Stuff like endgame is impossible if you don't have a highly specific team for skips, or the idea of low to medium investment builds being impossible without immense amounts of pre-planning. Like, don't get me wrong, there's some truly absurd things you can do if you completely pre-plan a run out. But even on Lunatic difficulty, that level of planning isn't necessary to beat the game, or even to use some off-meta builds. I went into my first run with no plan whatsoever and relatively little experience, and I was still able to get all but 2 children recruited. And not only that, I didn't skip a single map, fully engaging with the challenges presented by both Ryoma map and endgame. Maybe I'll do some sort of shorter video, not specifically talking about the run, but instead talking about the discussion around Conquest, since that was the core of what I wanted to get at anyway. I haven't really decided on that, it's still up in the air. The next video I got asked about was one of my December ones. It was the video about how and if we can engage with art that was made by people we find objectionable. This one is also kind of on the back burner. I do want to complete it eventually, but it's a pretty heavy topic to engage with, and as such, it can kind of be depressing to go into a recording session and be like, yeah, this TV show that I like was made by an abuser. Yup, this video game that I like was made by a racist. And sort of try to, tackle the complex feelings that go along with that. I actually haven't touched the project since I took my break for burnout. I still hope for it to come out eventually, but it'll probably take a lot longer than I intended, especially since I've had some developments in my personal life that actually kind of tie into the video topic, and I feel like putting my sort of raw feelings around that into the video could potentially be additive. I don't know. The last video I got a question on was my Dream of 5 review. I'm not sure if I ever explicitly said I plan on reviewing it, but I did stream it on my channel, so it's a safe assumption that I'm going to, and I am working on it. I'm hoping to have it out in the middle of March, but I really didn't enjoy that game, and it's not as much fun to make a negative review as it is to make a sort of glowing, praising review. Especially when it comes to indie games and ROM hacks where there's a small team or perhaps even just one person who worked on them, it can feel mean-spirited to be too negative, and so I try to balance the negativity that I feel with some positive aspects that I can observe. In fact, this is an approach that I think should generally be applied to all sort of criticism. It's the way that I tackled my Fire Emblem 7 video as well. And there are definitely elements of Dream of 5 that I did enjoy, but the large majority of the gameplay just did not work for me, and as a result of that, I'm struggling to not be overly negative in the review. The next set of questions are all Fire Emblem related. The first one is, who's your favorite bad unit to use? And I've been thinking about this. I don't actually think there's that many bad units in Fire Emblem that I enjoy using. In ROM hacks, there's definitely some stinkers who I find fun, such as the Est Josie from Call of the Armor. But I find that most bad units in vanilla Fire Emblem are not designed in a way that make them particularly enjoyable to use. I could train up someone like Wendy, dealing with 4 move and low accuracy the whole time, but the payoff is just a 5 move unit with okay combat. One of my favorite characters in Three Houses, Mercedes, just doesn't have any tools in her kit that are particularly useful. Even units who are more mediocre than bad, like Stall from Awakening, or Goldmary from Engage, don't really have anything that they offer to make them stand out in a fun way as compared to their competent peers. The main exception to this, of course, is my favorite game in the series, the Fates trilogy, especially Revelation. Despite how unbalanced the cast is, I think with an understanding of the Fates systems, you can take the bad units in Rev and make them do stuff that is relatively unique to them. And as such, within the mainline games, the bad units I like using are almost exclusively from the Rev cast. I'm a pretty huge fan of the 5 units you get in Chapter 14, Elise, Arthur, Effie, Benny, and Charlotte. And despite being just a boring, mediocre samurai, Hisame has grown on me a lot as of late, so probably those 6 would be my favorites. And if I had to narrow it down to just one of them, then definitely Benny. Although exclusively in Revelation, I don't really care for him in Conquest. The next question was, which unit would you say is the worst S-tier unit in all of Fire Emblem? I don't really know how to answer this, to be honest. I'm assuming that you mean the weakest unit who would still qualify for S-tier, and that's probably going to depend on where you cut off your tiers. Which, for me, is going to vary from game to game, because the sort of units who make it into S-tier in a cast as stacked as Conquest are going to be stronger than the sort of units who make it into S-tier in a game like Fire Emblem 7. I guess if I had to pick one, I would say Matthew from Fire Emblem 7. I have him as an S-tier unit because in Hector Hard Mode, he's how you get all of your promotion items. There are so many important stealables that happen before Legault joins, it's kind of ridiculous. But Matthew feels really bad to use, not only because his combat is abysmal, but also because FE7 deployment slots in Hector Hard Mode are really tight, and so the fact you have to deploy a thief on practically every map just doesn't feel good. I guess that's more about feeling than the strength, but From a design perspective, I would say the worst S-tier unit is either Seth or Sigurd. They both just do not feel fun to use. They're incredibly centralizing and make the games devolve into a sort of boring enemy phase spam with the Javelin or the Silver Lance or whatever weapon you've got equipped. Ironically, the fact that they are so strong is what makes them feel like the worst. Next question is, which unit is better, Pent from Fire Emblem 7 or Ophelia from Fire Emblem Conquest? And I'm gonna say Pent. While I definitely think both of these units are a little bit overrated, I think Ophelia is definitely more overrated than Pent. The next question is, when is the Fire Emblem 4 remake? And the answer is actually tomorrow. My uncle who works at Nintendo told me so. Next up, if you were locked in a room with every Fire Emblem antagonist and you were given a gun, who would you shoot first? Assume that all of the Fire Emblem characters die to the gun. Probably would shoot Garneth, because if he dies to the gun, and that shows that despite him saying you can't beat Garneth, I absolutely can beat Garneth, then the others are likely to be intimidated by how powerful the gun is, and they might even surrender without me needing to resort to further violence. Next question is, which Fire Emblem characters could and would you beat in a fight? If I still had the gun from the previous question, then all of them. That was stipulated in the requirements of the previous question, so I win. Next question is, do you think young Sheldon will be in Iron 18? Yes, he will. Next question is, how would you make the Fates Kitsune class better? I think there are a couple of ways that you could approach this. The boring one is just to give them access to a 1-2 range stone. This would definitely help in Birthright, since 1-2 range is a big part of that game's meta. But if we're just talking about the Revelation meta, then I think adding a 2-range stone would be enough to improve things. As the biggest problem that the Kitsune have is their frailty doesn't mesh well with the fact they want to double to secure kills. Although, unfortunately, because Wolfsegner is also in Revelation, Kitsune would probably still just feel like a worse version of that class. You could theoretically lock the stone to only be used by Kitsune as opposed to Wolfskin, but I feel like that's kinda lame. I like the idea of both of these species using the same stones and getting different transformations from them. So if I wanted to make them stand out from each other, I would give the Kitsune class, as well as both Kaden and Selkie, a respectable magic growth, and then add a magical beast stone. that either of the classes could use, but which was clearly more suited for the Kitsune than the wolf skin. You could also give them a better level 15 skill, but I think this is far from the worst of their problems. Addressing the stones is probably enough, since a lot of classes have pretty disappointing level 15 skills. Also, speaking of stones, I would make these stones come much earlier in Revelation, and also have Selkie start with a Beast Rune and Beast Stone Plus, similar to Valoria. That way, if you bench Keaton but are using Caden, then you can still get access to the stones early. I also think in the main campaign, the Beast Stone Plus and the Beast Rune should come sooner than they do in Rev. It's kind of weird that you get them both around the same time in Birthright and Conquest, but for some reason they're just wildly pushed back in Rev. The next question is, if you could own a Fire Emblem weapon, which one would you want to own or own a copy of? I guess if we're talking about it as a decoration, probably the Falchion. That's like the most iconic and recognizable one. If we're talking about as an actual weapon, I don't think I need any of them. I still have that gun from the previous question, and it should work on anyone who attacks me. The next question is, what is your opinion on lances throughout the series? I think lances are probably the most boring weapon type. Weirdly enough, they sort of try to fit the middle ground between the accuracy of swords and the might of axes, and it just kind of ends up feeling like nothing. Like, the only mainline games where lances feel especially good, it's usually not because lances themselves are good, but because a specific good unit is locked to lances. So for example, in Fire Emblem 8, Seth is using the javelin instead of the hand axe, because he can't use hand axes. But if Seth could use all weapon types, he would probably prefer to use hand axes. The closest that lances have come to being cool, in my opinion, is the approach that both Radiant Dawn and the 3DS games took when it comes to effective weapons, i.e. splitting them up into specific weapon types. So, for example, in Radiant Dawn, you only get a lance that is effective against cavalry, that being the Rider's Bane, and the same is true in Awakening. Fates also did this, although lances have to share their effectiveness with daggers, which is just an unfortunate place for them to be. And of course, if you're using renown rewards, you can also get the Hunter's Bow. So yeah, I think lances are probably the lamest weapon type in the series. I do like what Berwick Saga did with them, that being they're not incredibly high might weapons, but they gain might based on your movement, so they're best used by cavalry or the game's one wyvern. I think that's a pretty cool concept, and I would love to see that come to Fire Emblem. I know Emblem Sigurd does something similar, but I think it being tied to a specific lower might weapon type would definitely up the cool factor. It would kind of be like how daggers are supposed to be lower might, but they debuff enemies and have poison and those sorts of things. The next question is, if you were to compare Shamir and Catherine as the Christmas Cavaliers of Three Houses, who do you think is a better unit? I'm guessing you mean who is better in the Cavalier class line? I guess Catherine probably would be better in Cavalier than Shamir would. Neither of them really wants to go into the class, but Catherine at least has a reason to reclass out of Swordmaster. Whereas Shamir's main strength is just that Sniper is a very good class and she gets early access to it. Sniper gives her Hunter's Volley, which she loses if she reclasses, and it gives her a boost to the bow experience gain, making her one of the units who can possibly get a second copy of Bowfair before the game is over. I don't really think Catherine has that much to gain from going Cavalier. Even if you just want to increase her movement, I think going Pegasus Knight would be better since it comes with a good skill as well. The next question is, do you like Fire Emblem Awakening? And yeah, I like Fire Emblem Awakening. It's not my favorite Fire Emblem, but I think it's overhated. And on a related note, the next question is, do you have any videos explaining your favorite Fire Emblem games? Technically, I do have a video where I defend Fates Revelation, which is my favorite Fire Emblem game, but I think that video is not very good. Like I said, when I made it, I felt the need to go sort of half-assed on my praising of Rev, just because it had such a negative reputation within the community. But now I am full-throated Rev enjoyer. But yeah, I guess that video would be the closest thing I have. Next question is, what keeps you coming back to Fire Emblem? Specifically older entries in the series, such as Fire Emblem 4. Well, I actually have the kind of controversial opinion of not particularly caring for Fire Emblem 4. I like a lot of the core mechanics, stuff like the pawn shop system and the generational jump and sort of pairing people up like that, but I think that the moment-to-moment gameplay, the maps, the arena, all the stuff like that, I find just kind of thoroughly unenjoyable and mindless. In fact, this is kind of a weird moment to get this question because I've been thinking about replaying Fire Emblem games and how that isn't as appealing to me as it used to be, with the exception of Rev and Conquest. And I think one of the big things about these two games that makes them feel much more replayable to me than the others is just how customizable your units and your team are. In Three Houses and Engage, you can also customize your team, but it feels a lot less, impactful. A lot of the units just kind of blend together. They don't really stand out from each other. Whereas the unique support system in Fates makes everyone very distinct. I don't think every playthrough needs to be different for it to still be enjoyable, but for me, the appeal is going to wear off with more and more repetition. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask this question, sorry. Next question is, will you Iron Man Berwick Saga? The answer is no, I didn't really care for Berwick Saga, actually. In fact, a lot of what I just said about Fire Emblem 4 I feel like applies to Berwick Saga, where there's a lot of cool ideas at its core, but the fundamental gameplay really turned me off. Although it wasn't the maps that did it for me so much as the city simulator and how slow that process was. It felt like a beta version of the Monastery or Somniel and was bogged down with many of the same problems that they had. Only because it's a Kaga game, it was also incredibly esoteric. So I had to play with Serenus Forest open on Microsoft Edge in the other window. I actually never ended up finishing my playthrough of Berwick, which is why I didn't make a video on it. I considered making a video just about the amount of the game that I did play, but I have so many projects on my plate right now, I really don't need to add another one. Next question is, what Fire Emblem character would you marry for life? None of them. I personally don't really see myself, romantically with any of the fictional characters. No judgment for people who do, I just don't really engage with, waifu culture. Alright, the last Fire Emblem-related question I got was, if you were a Fates unit, what would be your starting class, your Heartseal class, and your personal skill? And I think this is a really cool thought experiment. I would love to hear other people give their answers in the comments below. As for me, I'd give myself Armor Knight as a base class and Apothecary as my reclass. That way, I'm locked into defensive options. And my personal skill would be something similar to Etier in Fire Emblem Engage. I'd get a stat boost from using a consumable item, whether that's a tonic or a vulnerary. And this would stack with the Apothecary skills, if you class dip that way. As for the exact numbers of the stat boost, I don't think they can be too extreme. I think +1 in a couple of stats is probably the best you can do without it becoming way too broken. So I'm gonna go with 1 strength and 1 speed to mirror Laszlo's fancy footwork. Alright, next is a roundup of just other various miscellaneous questions. First is, do you like Advance Wars? Yeah, I really like Advance Wars. I've played 1, 2, and DS as well as the remake, and I liked all of them. One of these days, I want to get around to playing Days of Ruin, but it's just on a long backlog list. Next up, do you have a fursona? No, I do not have a fursona. Much like with waifus, I don't say that with any sort of judgment, it's just not the sort of thing I'm into. Next question, have you ever played any TCGs? I'm assuming that you mean trading card games, Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh type deal. I was actually super into Magic the Gathering for about half a decade. I would travel around the United States going to various Magic tournaments. I went to GP Vegas back when that was a thing and it was big. I stopped playing when COVID came out. I mean, I have Magic Online, Modo, the old Magic Online. And I have Legacy Lands, but it is an extremely outdated version of Legacy Lands. It matches the Legacy Lands I have in real life. Although, I guess, technically, no, because I got a couple of new cards for lands in real life. But I just wasn't keeping up because I couldn't go to tournaments in COVID, and for me, a lot of the real fun is going to tournaments. I would travel with my friends. I was working part-time at a hotel, so we could get $40 hotel rooms and just cram 5 people in the room. Everyone pays $10. It was pretty awesome. But when COVID happened, it wasn't safe to go to tournaments anymore, and most tournaments ended up getting shut down anyway, and Wizards did a bunch of restructuring, and now Legacy is basically an unsupported format, and with all of the power creep from the various, like, Modern Horizons sets and Universes Beyond and stuff, most of the decks that I'm familiar with in Legacy meta just don't exist anymore, and a lot of Magic, especially in the older formats, comes from meta knowledge, like knowing what you're up against. You see what cards your opponent plays, like on turn one, or their play patterns or whatever, and you can accurately predict and sort of play around things. And so I really don't feel like devoting the amount of time it would take to sort of relearn the meta, as well as the money to upgrade my deck. Like, I have the most expensive cards that I would need for it. Like, nothing's going to be more expensive than Tabernacle. But it's still like, I don't want to spend several $100s upgrading my deck every couple of months when Wizards keeps pooping out this shit. I'm still familiar enough with Magic that I can enjoy watching some Magic the Gathering YouTubers, but I think my interest in getting back into the game has just completely gone away, which is a shame, because it was a huge hobby for me. It was one of my favorite hobbies. Which I guess kind of answers the next question, which is, what is your favorite non-video game hobby? It used to be Magic the Gathering. I've got a lot of used to be fun hobbies. Like, I used to go hiking a bunch, but now I can't because of my disability. I used to play Magic the Gathering a bunch, but the meta shifted a bunch and don't really have the money to travel. I used to like traveling a bunch, but as I got older, like, I'm in my 30s now, road trips are too draining. I live kind of a boring life. I guess board games would be the big one that I like doing. We have board games with the in-laws game night. There is a local, like, publicly available game night thing that I've been to a few times through, I think it's called Meetup. There's an app on your phone where you can, like, meet people. Not sponsored. But I've been a few times. It's just a matter of the timing is awkward because their game night is around the time my wife and I usually have dinner on Mondays, and my wife is usually pretty tired when she comes home from work, so I don't want to be like, okay, well, let's go out to game night and get food at a restaurant, because then that, it's expensive. It's so expensive having hobbies as an adult. Like, it's just pricey. Yeah. Next question is, what is your favorite thing you've never talked about on the channel before? And I think when it comes to live streams, I talk about most of the things I enjoy on the channel, unless it's like specific TV shows or stuff. But I've talked about, my cats, I've talked about board games, I've talked about like general subjects. I've talked about Magic the Gathering, which isn't even like general subject, like that's highly specific. Obviously I've talked about video games. I used to be really into like outdoorsy stuff, but the place that I've moved to, because I used to live near a bunch of national parks, but now I don't, so I can't really, there's not really much outdoorsy stuff. I used to be really into baking as well, but our kitchen is a lot smaller than the one in my old house, and also, depression just makes it harder to get into those more, you have to pay attention and, be engaged with stuff activities. Next question, have you ever tried Dr. Brown's Black Cherry? No, I have not. Next question is, did you know Among Us is woke? I haven't looked at the woke games sheet since I did that stream, so I believe it. I don't know why, but I believe it. Oh, I know why. It's because you can have pride flags as your banner. That's why it is. You can get pride flags as your banner. Next question, have you ever been to France? No, I have not. I've been to a lot of other countries in Europe, but not France. Have you ever watched Neon Genesis Evangelion, or EOE? I don't know if they're the same thing or different things, but I haven't watched either of them. What is your favorite movie and favorite TV show? So, I don't really like picking favorites because I'm too indecisive to pick, one definitive favorite. So, I'll just say some of my favorite television shows are BoJack Horseman, Better Call Saul, and The Good Place. I think those are all phenomenal shows. I also really, really liked Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. It's the only unironically good thing that's come out of the CW. I know the show's title sounds like it leans into misogynist stereotypes, but it's actually intentional. It's a sort of breakdown of the rom-com genre, basically analyzing what would it be like if a person acted like a romantic comedy love interest did in real life, and how that would actually be quite scary. And then It takes it to its logical conclusion, but manages to still be really emotionally resonant, and have a really nuanced view on mental health, specifically around borderline personality disorder. Also, it's a musical where characters will just sort of break out into song frequently, and oftentimes they're very good songs. They're usually parodies of already existing songs. And if you think that sounds like Weird Al, I think the showrunners did too, because he actually makes a cameo in one of the final episodes just as a random person. Yeah, really good show, would highly recommend. If I was forced to pick one favorite, probably Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, even though from a quality standpoint, it's definitely weaker than some of the other ones I listed. Alright, next question is, what is your opinion on O'Doyle's Poorhouse in Barnegat, New Jersey? I went there one time when I was visiting a friend in New Jersey on a road trip. I was doing a road trip from North Carolina to Boston. And I enjoyed myself, but I don't know if I enjoyed myself, probably just because I was, like, hanging out with a friend. I don't really like drinking, so I don't really like, bars and stuff, because I don't really drink. Next up, what is your opinion on vehicular manslaughter? I tend to think negatively of it, although it will depend on who gets slaughtered. If somebody ran over Adolf Hitler, I feel like at that point, vehicular manslaughter is kind of based, but generally, I think most of the time, vehicular manslaughter is actually cringe. Next up, what is your opinion on the letter H? Awful. It's even lower than F tier. Even lower than G tier, actually. Although, from another perspective, it's higher than S tier. So, maybe it's not so awful. Next question was, do you have a favorite non-Fire Emblem SRPG? So, it's not out yet, but just from the demo that I played, I think Years of Division is almost certainly going to be my favorite non-Fire Emblem SRPG when it comes out. If I have to pick a game that's already out, though, Triangle Strategy. I quite like Triangle Strategy as well. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Super speed, like the Flash type super speed, because secretly that is just also invincibility, and the ability to phase through walls, and just it's really powerful. It's a bunch of cool stuff all wrapped up in one power, but you just pick one power. It doesn't sound as overpowered, so they let you get away with it. Next question is, an empty trolley is going down a track headed for 5 people. You can pull a lever to divert the trolley so that it runs over only one person. However, there is another empty trolley heading for another group of 5 people, with another lever that diverts the trolley back towards a track with only one person, and another person in control of that lever who has different ethical philosophical leanings than you. If neither of you pull the levers, nothing will happen to either of you, but the trolleys will run over 10 people total. If one of you pulls the lever and the other one doesn't, the one who pulls the lever will be sentenced harshly by the courts for murder, because everyone in this hypothetical scenario has exceptionally unnuanced deontological leanings. If you both pull levers, you will be considered as accomplices to the same crime of running over 2 people with the trolleys, and this thought experiment will present you with a prisoner's dilemma. Do you pull the lever? My answer is that using the super speed I gained from the previous question, I pull the lever to divert the trolley, and then, before anything else happens, I replace the pieces of the lever one at a time until I have fully constructed a lever that is identical to how it was before, but every single individual piece is different. And if the courts tried to convict me for murder, then I simply tell them I didn't actually pull the lever, and I'm able to pass a lie detector test because we assume in this thought experiment that lie detectors are actually 100% accurate. Because I believe that the solution to Ship of Theseus is that this lever is no longer the same lever that it used to be. Therefore, I'm able to pass the lie detector test, and as a result of that, I don't end up going to prison at all. There's no more punishment. Next question. What do you get if you combine lesbians with dinosaurs? Probably lesbian dinosaurs? Maybe it's a trick question. Is this a Xenoblade thing? This is probably a fucking Xenoblade thing, isn't it? Next question is, what was your favorite story beat in Vampire Emblem? My favorite part wasn't fully in the story, it was kind of gameplay story integration. They were trying to teach you that fielding Jagans is bad and they're EXP thieves, so there's a secret mechanic behind the scenes that if you field your Jagan for more than 3 maps where they're not force deployed, it actually deletes your save files, not just for Vampire Emblem, but for all of the other games you have on the Switch console. And what it does is then the darkness actually consumed all those other worlds, because it's talking about how, like, oh, you know, he's supposed to be strong, but if you use him too much, then everything will leak out and the multiverse will get destroyed. I thought that was really cool, because then it implies that the multiverse is actually all of the other Nintendo properties, because they were getting destroyed by his darkness that leaked out. That was really neat. I liked it when that happened. Next question is, what was your favorite subject in school? I'm gonna go with college instead of school, because I think, like, grade school and stuff just has the basic things. But in college, so this is a long story, okay? Story time off of a fucking, like, a basic question. So when I was 18, I worked a job at a summer camp that didn't have any Wi-Fi. It was in between high school and college. I didn't have access to the internet. So in preparation for college, I didn't get to pick my classes. Instead, my parents picked all of my classes for me. And my parents are, like, highly conservative, like, Christian family. I had a very sheltered upbringing. And so as a result of that, they picked just the most bog standard, boring classes that you could have. You know, they picked, I think, Introduction to Statistics, even though it wasn't even part of the common curriculum. They were just like, yeah, you know, math. We'll do math, history, English. They picked, like, a bunch of classes that didn't even help towards graduation, didn't help towards my major, didn't help towards anything. They were just like, yeah, we'll just pick, like, the boring high school-y classes. And for history, they picked one that was called History 104, American, and then it ended, and so they assumed it was American history. But it wasn't. And this was actually the first class that I went to, the first college course that I went to, and it was a pretty interesting awakening, because I sit down in the class on the first day of class, the first class that I've been to, 8 o'clock in the morning, and the teacher pulls down the little PowerPoint projector, and the first slide is a very zoomed in pill with a smiley face on it. And he goes, "Someone tell me what this is." And the whole room is silent, and I don't know what it is. Like I said, I lived a very sheltered upbringing, but we spent about 5 minutes, and he keeps saying, like, the class is not going to go forward until someone tells me what it is. You're a room full of college students, someone knows what it is. But then the quiet girl sitting next to me, she was actually one of my friends, she finally is the one to speak up, and she says, "That's MDMA." And the professor says, and I'll never forget this exact quote, the professor says, "Don't be a fucking cop. Nobody calls it that. What is this?" And she goes, "Oh, that's ecstasy." And slowly, as we go through the slideshow, it occurs to me that this is not normal American history. In fact, it wasn't even focused on American history. Apparently, there was just an error on the online listings and whatnot. This was the course name, I believe the official course name was A History of Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, although we didn't talk too much about rock and roll. And it did cover things on a predominantly global scale, although we did focus on the United States more than any other country, I think simply because that was the area of the world that the professor was most familiar with. But it was a really interesting class. Obviously the appeal was like, woo, drugs, woo, alcohol, college students, yeah! But there were some cool papers and subjects that I ended up covering from it. I remember I wrote a paper about how the link between bestiality laws and racism within the United States, because oftentimes they would leverage bestiality laws against white women who had slept with black men, which of course has the obvious racist connotation of, like, they're animals in quotation marks. I had a pretty in-depth essay that I wrote about the ties between Judeo-Christian Islamic religions and alcohol, and how the alcohol is treated very differently from other substances, both culturally and legally, and how much that is tied into those religions, especially Christianity, because of the communion sacrament and wine and stuff like that, and how it sort of actually stretched back to alcohol used to be treated as more extreme than other substances, and Christianity sort of glommed onto that because it was edgy, right? And it attracted people to Christianity that they got to drink wine. And then as Christianity became more prolific throughout the world, suddenly wine became seen as more acceptable, and by extension, alcohol, since, alcohol is in wine. Meanwhile, a lot of the cultural and legal attitudes towards various plant-based drugs, especially opioids and marijuana, come from trying to stamp down pagan religions, where oftentimes smoking, those sorts of things, would be tied into certain religious ceremonies with them. That's not to say that the class didn't have some raunchy, haha drugs, haha sex moments, though. And I think a big part of the appeal was the way that the class handled these topics and sort of had fun with the taboo. But anyway, that class was pretty cool, but that wasn't my favorite class. This was just preamble to work up to my favorite class, because then the next year, a different professor had a class that was called The Politics of Sex, that the history of sex, drug, and rock and roll was a prerequisite to. And so I signed up for that one, thinking, it's going to be a lot more of the same, sort of focus on the more raunchy aspects of it, but then tying it into the sort of more thoughtful things, right? And for the first 2 weeks, the class did present that way. It presented very similarly to History of Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, but with a bigger emphasis on the sex aspect of things. However, after 2 weeks, something very important happened. You were no longer able to drop a class without it being marked on your record. It would be instead marked as dropped and would tell you whether you dropped while you were passing or dropped while you were failing. And at that point, the focus of the class radically shifted from haha sex is funny to an extremely feminist breakdown of sex and gender as a whole. Diving into stuff like the patriarchy, into trans stuff, into the gender binary in general, into the Kinsey scale and how it kind of fails to fully capture the nuances and complexity of sexuality, into stuff around intersex people. There were dives into the concepts of polyamory and ethical non-monogamy. We did a segment about fetishes and what fetishes are considered to be more normal, stuff like feet or spanking or handcuffs versus fetishes that are considered to not be normal, and what we point and laugh at as these are the shameful fetishes. We covered a lot of really interesting and thought-provoking topics. And we had a movie night every Wednesday that we had to go to and respond to. And a lot of these movies were also really interesting. They would all play on gender stuff. And a lot of them ended up being foreign films or indie films that I wouldn't have encountered otherwise. So I was happy about that aspect as well. So yeah, that is my favorite subject in school, the politics of sex and gender. Okay, one more question is, what are your top 25 favorite non-Fire Emblem video games? I think you're kind of stretching the definition of a question for a Q&A, but fuck it, I'll take the challenge. These are not in any particular order, and I went out of my way to ensure that I didn't pick two games from the same series. So, for example, Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 would probably both make the list, but I narrowed it down to just Dark Souls, because otherwise, all 5 Donkey Kong Country games would take up a fifth of the list. So, in no particular order, Dark Souls 1, which I think is not only the best Dark Souls, but the best Souls-like I've ever played. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Like I said, all 5 DK games would probably make the list if I didn't give myself the restriction, but Tropical Freeze is definitely the best of them. Yakuza Kiwami 2. Again, a lot of Yakuza games would probably make the list, and I'm cheating a little by counting Judgment as a separate series, because honestly, if I didn't, then Judgment would make the list, and Yakuza would not have any mainline entries on there, and that's not fair, because the Yakuza games are really, really good. Deep Rock Galactic, I've sort of fallen off of it in recent times. The 2 Roxbox updates just sort of really turned me off, but I've sunk so much time into DRG, and I love playing with friends, love playing with my wife, so I feel like it has to make the list, even though it's one that I very rarely go back to nowadays. Hitman 2, specifically from the World of Assassination trilogy. Hitman 1 would probably have also made the list if it weren't for the restriction I gave myself. Resident Evil 1's remake. I really like RE1 Remake. I am a half-hearted tank controls defender. And I think it's done badly in some games. But even like in Code Veronica, where it's done very badly, I still like them. I think they are, I think that the argument of like, they add to the horror because you can't control things is kind of stupid, but at the same time, I like the difficulty in control from tank controls. Hollow Knight is phenomenal game. Go back and replay it every couple of years. I could be playing new games that I haven't experienced, but they would not be as good as Hollow Knight. Arkham Origins, the Arkham series would also probably occupy a bunch of entries if I didn't restrict myself. Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, that one should probably be obvious. I've talked about it a bunch. I've done videos on it a bunch. They perform worse than Fire Emblem. But if I could be anything other than a Fire Emblem channel, well, probably not a Paper Mario channel, actually, because there's only 2 good Paper Mario games. I'd get sick of it real quick. Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2. I liked 3. I know 3 gets a lot of hate, but I liked 3. Hated 1. Mass Effect 1's garbage, but I like 2 and 3. Disco Elysium. Disco Elysium is quite good. I really like that. Lego Star Wars. I couldn't really pick what Lego game was my favorite. I thought maybe I would go with Lego Batman, but it's so buggy and it does have some like motion sickness issues. So I ended up going with the OG, Lego Star Wars, probably the complete trilogy, the complete saga, all 6 of them is what I would go with, not the new one that's apparently like really bad, but yeah, Lego Star Wars. Dead Space, again, not the remake, the original, really like Dead Space. Dead Space 2 was also alright, and then Dead Space 3, I got like 2 hours in, and I couldn't, it was not fun. Pokemon Black 2, I really like the Pokemon series, but I'll be honest, unlike other game series that I've talked about, it's not one that I think was ever at risk of taking up a ton of slots. Like, maybe Black and White 1 would also be on it, but otherwise it's just Black and White 2. The Gen 5 games and the Gen 1 games are like the big, these are good games for me. Crash Bandicoot 4, I know that it's kind of contentious within the Crash community because 100%ing it is definitely a nightmare, but my approach is you don't have to 100% it. You don't have to settle for just like either beating the game or 100%ing it. What you can do is try to get as many box gems as possible. I got all of the uninverted box gems, and that was enough for me, because like, fuck the inverted world. Psychonauts. I've heard Psychonauts 2 is really good. It's significantly better than Psychonauts 1, but I haven't gotten around to it yet, even though I was one of the... It wasn't Kickstarter. There's like a... Oh, fuck. Basically game Kickstarter. I was one of the backers, so I got it not for free, like as a backer reward, but I just haven't played it. Doom 2016. Really liked Doom 2016. Probably my favorite shooter ever, if I had to pick. I mean, it's the only shooter that made this list. Unless I guess you technically count Hitman, but like you shouldn't. Well, DRG is a shooter. Yeah, really like Doom 2016. Dishonored, I guess, is also technically a shooter, and I have Dishonored 2 on here. So Dishonored 2, yeah. Also really good. I think a bit more of a stealth game than a shooter. I guess technically portions of Banjo-Tooie are a shooter, and I have Banjo-Tooie on here. Rareware was really proud of GoldenEye, so they put GoldenEye in Banjo-Tooie, but that's not why I have it on here. It's just like my favorite 3D collectathon. I think it's really good. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, I know like Melee heads are gonna hate me, but I just like I play more casually, so I like the game that has all the dudes. I like the one that has more people, because it has more people I can play with as like a casual gamer. I have to give up my gamer card. This one's a recent one that I played, Slay the Princess. I played it on stream, and I loved it. It was really good. It fucked me up. Really good. And last but not least, Bloodborne. Bloodborne was the first Souls game I played, which is probably why I have so much affinity with it. I think that it is, on like a fundamental level, probably lesser than Dark Souls 1, although it is also faster. I don't know. The thing is that I like the really fast combat in Bloodborne, but I don't like it in other Souls-like. I think it's not good in Dark Souls 3. In fact, I fucking hate Dark Souls 3. And it's, like, not my favorite in Elden Ring. I have a lot of issues with Elden Ring. But I fucking love it in Bloodborne. And I kind of like it in Sekiro, but I love it in Bloodborne. It's so good. Okay, that's the list. Bye.